It's 1882. A man limps into a dusty general store somewhere in Kansas. His knee is swollen like a full bladder. Every step is a stab of pain. He hasn't slept in 3 days because of it. There's no doctor in town. The nearest one is 2 days on horseback. The store owner looks at him for a long second, opens a wooden drawer behind the counter, and pulls out a dark glass bottle. Inside, a thick oil, almost black. He drops 3 drops into a glass of water and pushes it toward the man without a word. The man drinks. He winces, and 6 hours later, he sleeps for the first time in days. What was in that bottle? Cannabis. Hemp tincture. Sold legally, without a prescription, in pharmacies and general stores across the American territory for most of the 19th century. What you're about to hear is not alternative history. It is not romanticization. It is what actually happened in the Old West, a period when cannabis was a widely accepted medical tool, used in 12 different ways by cowboys, settlers, field doctors, and indigenous healers. A period that was erased from collective memory so completely that it seems like fiction, but it isn't. And today we're going to prove that. To understand how cannabis reached the American Old West, we need to step back a little in time. The plant is not native to the Americas. It came from Central Asia, traveled the world across millennia of medicinal and spiritual use, reached Europe, and was brought from there by colonizers to the New World. By the early 19th century, medicinal cannabis, called cannabis indica in the pharmacy manuals of the time, was already cataloged in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the country's official guide to medicines. This means it was considered a legitimate remedy, tested and approved by the institutional medicine of the era. Any pharmacist could produce it. Anyone could buy it. And in the Old West, where medical infrastructure was completely absent, where wounds became infected and killed within days, where chronic pain was the constant companion of anyone who worked with their body, cannabis found fertile ground. It was in the bottles of traveling pharmacies, in the bags of midwives, in the medical kits of the armies advancing across the continent, and in the knowledge of indigenous and Mexican communities that had been using the plant far longer than any white settler. What followed was one of the most fascinating and forgotten stories in American medicine. 12 different uses. 12 ways a single plant saved lives, relieved suffering, and helped people survive in a world that did not forgive weakness. The first use, relieving the chronic pain of cowboys. Let's start with the most obvious, because it was the most common. A cowboy's life was a constant accumulation of physical damage. Falls from horses, bones broken and never properly healed, muscles torn by heavy labor, joints destroyed by years of riding in every kind of weather. By 35, many cowboys had the body of a 60-year-old man. By 40, many could barely mount a horse. Cannabis tincture, extracted in alcohol and sold in small dark bottles, was taken internally in drops, mixed with water or whiskey. There was no precise dosage. It was an empirical art. Start small, increase until the pain recedes enough to function. For chronic joint and muscle pain, it worked. It cured nothing, but it made the day bearable. What the cowboys of the time had no words to describe, and what modern science would explain centuries later, was the interaction of cannabinoids with pain receptors in the nervous system. They only knew the result. After a few drops of that dark oil, the pain retreated. And in a world with no other option besides enduring, that was enough. The second use, improvised anesthesia before surgical procedures. Amputation of a finger crushed by a horseshoe. Removal of a bullet lodged in the shoulder. Cauterization of a gangrenous wound with a hot iron. Extraction of a rotten tooth with pliers. These procedures happened regularly in the Old West. And when they happened, the patient needed to be prepared in some way, because the shock of pain alone could kill before the surgery was even finished. Whiskey was the first resort. But whiskey has a serious problem. In doses high enough to suppress surgical pain, it also suppresses breathing. Combined with cannabis, however, the sedative effect was amplified without the same respiratory risk of pure alcohol. Military field doctors who accompanied expeditions across the continent carried cannabis tinctures in their kits with documented regularity. Records from the American Army in the post-Civil War period mention the use of cannabis preparations for pain management in wounded soldiers. It was not anesthesia in the modern sense. It was a desperate attempt to make the unbearable merely terrible. The patient received the tincture. Half an hour was allowed to pass, and then the procedure began. He still felt it. He still screamed, most of the time. But there were accounts of patients maintaining partial consciousness, which was paradoxically necessary, because sometimes the doctor needed the patient to move or respond during the procedure. The third use, treatment of muscle spasms and epilepsy. Here the story grows darker and more human. Epilepsy in the 19th century was a terrifying diagnosis. There was no understanding of the neurological basis of the disease. Seizures were frequently interpreted as demonic possession, madness, divine punishment. Epileptic people were marginalized, hidden by their families, sent to asylums where therapy consisted of physical restraint and isolation. In the Old West, where there were no asylums and where every family member needed to be functional for the group's survival, an epileptic child was a burden the family carried with love and terror in equal measure. Each seizure could be the last. Each episode could result in head trauma, suffocation, or death from an accident during the episode. And here, cannabis entered in a way that was not understood but was empirically observed. Regular doses of tincture reduced the frequency of seizures in some patients. Not in all, not consistently, but enough that healers and some more open-minded doctors began recommending its use. The British Journal of Mental Science published, in 1843, an article by physician W.B. O'Shaughnessy documenting the use of cannabis for epilepsy, and that knowledge circulated in American medical circles over the following decades. A mother in Nebraska who happened to read the right medical journal, or who was lucky enough to find the right doctor, might turn to cannabis as a last resort for her child. Sometimes it worked, and when it worked, it was treated almost as a miracle. The fourth use, relieving suffering during childbirth. Giving birth in the Old West was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Maternal mortality was devastating. Complicated deliveries, without a doctor, without proper instruments, without any form of anesthesia, frequently resulted in the death of the mother, the baby, or both. Midwives, the women who carried the obstetric knowledge of their communities, developed over time a set of practices to make childbirth less fatal and less agonizing. And in many communities, especially among settlers of German and Mexican origin, cannabis tincture was part of that practice. It was given in the hours before active labor, in small doses, to reduce the anxiety and fear that tightened muscles and complicated the process. It was not a powerful enough analgesic to suppress the pain of childbirth. No substance available at that time was. But the anxiogenic effect, the mild muscle relaxation, the reduction of panic, had real value in a process where muscular rigidity caused by terror could literally kill the mother. There was risk. No one knew exactly what passed to the baby through the circulation. But in a choice between certain death and an unknown risk, the midwives of the Old West chose the risk. And many babies were born because their mothers managed, with the help of a few drops of dark tincture, to cross the ordeal of childbirth without losing their lives in the process. The fifth use, treatment of insomnia and nervous collapse. The frontier destroyed mental health in ways that no one at the time had the vocabulary to describe. The extreme isolation, the constant losses of children, of animals, of harvests, of neighbors swept away by disease. The permanent fear of attacks, of brutal winters, of crop failures that meant starvation. What we would recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder, severe depression, or generalized anxiety disorder was called at the time nerves, melancholy, weakness of spirit. And for that, doctors prescribed cannabis regularly. The American Pharmacopoeia of the period listed cannabis indica as a treatment for insomnia, neuralgia, and states of nervous agitation. This was not folk perception. It was official medicine. And it worked, in the sense that the sedative effect of cannabis allowed people in emotional collapse to sleep, and sleep itself was often what the nervous system needed to avoid completely disintegrating. There were documented cases of men arriving in towns after months alone in the wilderness, a state of severe disorientation, unable to hold a coherent conversation, waking up screaming, refusing food. In those cases, cannabis tincture was administered over consecutive days as part of a recovery protocol that also included adequate nutrition, rest, and human contact. Some recovered, others did not. But cannabis was a real tool in that process. The sixth use, controlling nausea and vomiting in gastrointestinal diseases. Dysentery killed more people in the Old West than bullets, more than snakes, more than any wild animal. Contaminated water, poorly preserved meat, the impossible hygiene conditions of wagon trains and encampments created an environment where intestinal infections were endemic and frequently fatal. The mechanism of death was dehydration. The body tried to expel the infection, vomited and evacuated everything, including the water necessary to survive. And when the patient could no longer keep any liquid down, death was a matter of hours. Cannabis, especially in small doses of tincture administered slowly, had a real antiemetic effect. It reduced the urge to vomit. This allowed the patient to keep fluids in the stomach long enough to begin rehydration. It did not cure the infection, but it broke the deadly cycle of vomiting and dehydration that led to death. Military doctors who documented epidemics of cholera and dysentery among troops in the 1860s and 1870s mentioned the use of cannabis preparations as part of the treatment protocol. The science behind it, the endocannabinoid receptors that regulate gastrointestinal motility, would not be discovered for more than a century. But the empirical effect was observed and used. The seventh use, salve for wounds and burns. Not every use was internal. Cannabis also reached the body from the outside in. Warmed and crushed cannabis leaves formed a paste that was applied directly onto open wounds, burns, and skin infections. The practice was common among Mexican communities in the American Southwest, who had access to locally grown cannabis and a far richer ethnobotanical knowledge than the newly arrived Anglo-Saxon settlers. The paste had limited antibacterial properties, not enough to fight severe infections, but helped keep the wound moist and protected during the healing process. In a period when most bandages were made of reused linen cloth, sometimes contaminated, a paste of fresh plant material was paradoxically cleaner. For burns, and there were many, in a world of open fires, hot iron, and scorching sun, the external application of cannabis preparations relieved local pain more directly than an internal tincture. It was topical, physical, immediate relief. And cowboys who worked with hot iron in smithies, or women who cooked over open flames for hours, quickly learned the value of that green, pungent remedy. The eighth use, treatment of severe migraines. Migraines in the Old West were a form of torture. There was no adequate darkness. The cabins had gaps where light crept through. There was no silence. The noise of animals, wind, children, and work was constant. There was no guaranteed rest. In a subsistence family, stopping work for days because of a headache was a luxury few could afford. People with chronic migraines were frequently labeled fragile, hysterical, or exaggerating, especially women. The prevailing belief was that migraines were a matter of temperament, not physiology, and therefore not deserving of serious treatment. Some doctors disagreed, and those doctors prescribed cannabis. Specifically, tincture of cannabis indica administered at the onset of symptoms, before the pain reached its peak, with the aim of aborting the episode before it became incapacitating. There are records of physicians in cities like Denver and San Francisco in the 1870s and 1880s prescribing cannabis specifically for migraines with results they described as consistent. It did not work for everyone, but for a portion of patients, cannabis was the only resource capable of making migraines manageable, and therefore ensuring that person remained functional in a world that waited for no one. The ninth use, relief from coughs and respiratory diseases. This will seem counterintuitive to modern ears, cannabis being used to treat respiratory problems. But in the 19th century, the method of administration was completely different, and there was a logic behind the use. It was not smoked to treat lung diseases. It was taken as an oral tincture or as a syrup prepared with cannabis extract dissolved in honey and warm water. And the intended effect was twofold: the relaxation of the muscles of the respiratory tract, which relieved the spasm of chronic coughing, and the general sedative effect, which allowed a patient with bronchitis or tuberculosis to sleep, something the persistent cough made impossible. Tuberculosis, called consumption at the time, was one of the leading causes of death in the Old West. There was no cure. Treatment was palliative, trying to keep the patient comfortable enough for the body to fight as long as possible. And in that context, anything that reduced coughing, allowed sleep, and maintained appetite had immense value. There are accounts of doctors who established sanatoriums in the dry climate of Arizona and New Mexico to treat tuberculosis patients, and who regularly used cannabis as part of the palliative regimen. They promised no cure, but they promised less suffering. And in a disease that kills slowly and through progressive suffocation, less suffering was a promise worth a great deal. The 10th use: the knowledge of Mexican and indigenous healers. Here we need to stop and acknowledge something that official history frequently erases. The most sophisticated medicinal knowledge available in the Old West was not in the medical manuals of white settlers. It was in the indigenous and Mexican communities that had inhabited that land long before the American expansion. Curandras, the specialist in natural medicine of the Mexican communities of the Southwest, had a deep knowledge of cannabis that went far beyond anything any pharmacist in Boston or New York could offer. They knew the variations of the plant, the differences between preparations, the appropriate dosages for different conditions and different physical constitutions. For these women, cannabis was just one tool in a vast arsenal of medicinal plants that had been refined across generations. And when settlers arrived sick and desperate, after their own treatment attempts had failed, some had enough humility to accept help. And those people survived at higher rates. What is profoundly unjust in this history is that this knowledge was treated with contempt for decades during the American expansion, and then, when Western science finally began to study cannabis seriously in the late 19th century, credit went to European and American physicians who discovered what Mexican and native healers had known for centuries. The 11th use: treatment of glaucoma and vision problems. This use is perhaps the most surprising and one of the best documented. 19th century physicians observed that patients who used cannabis regularly reported improvements in night vision and a reduction in eye pain associated with what we would today identify as glaucoma. Without understanding the mechanism, the reduction in intraocular pressure that cannabinoids produce, doctors recorded the effect empirically and began recommending its use. In the Old West, where vision problems caused by extreme exposure to sun, dust, and unhealthy working environments were extremely common, this use had immediate relevance. A cowboy who lost his vision was a cowboy who could not work. And a worker who could not work, in the context of frontier survival, was potentially condemned. The tincture administered orally several times a day for the management of a chronic vision condition. That protocol existed. It was practiced, and for some patients, it worked well enough to preserve working capacity for years beyond what the condition would have allowed without treatment. The 12th use: end of life, comfort in the final moments. And we arrive at the last use, the quietest one, the one no one likes to mention, but which was perhaps the most human of all. In the Old West, dying was often a slow and painful process. Infected wounds that spread gradually. Tuberculosis that consumed the patient over months. Cancer, which existed, which killed, which had no clear name and no treatment whatsoever. Organ failure that today would be treated with a transplant or dialysis. When it became clear that nothing more could be done, when the doctor or the healer looked at the patient's condition and knew the end was a matter of days or weeks, cannabis entered as palliative care. Not to cure, to ease. Larger doses, administered more frequently. Enough to reduce the perception of pain, to induce a state of relaxation where labored breathing became less terrifying, where the final days were less an agony and more a gradual withdrawal from the world. There was a dignity in this use that Western medicine of the time rarely offered. And there was something more relief for the family. Because watching someone die in extreme agony for days or weeks leaves marks that do not heal. A quieter, more peaceful death, with less screaming and less convulsing, also protected those who remained. And in the Old West, where trauma was accumulated in layers upon layers, any protection possible had value. What happened to all of this? Here is the question that needs to be asked. If cannabis was widely used, widely accepted by official medicine, and sold legally across the country, what happened? The answer is complex, but its outlines are clear. In the early 20th century, a combination of factors began to hollow out the space that cannabis occupied. The emerging pharmaceutical industry, with its patented synthetic products, had no interest in competing with a plant that anyone could grow in their backyard. There were racial and political tensions involving the Mexican communities that were associated with cannabis use, and criminalizing the plant was, among other things, a way of criminalizing those communities. And there was a growing puritanism toward any substance that altered consciousness. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively banned the use of cannabis in the United States. Decades of accumulated medical knowledge were discarded with a political stroke of a pen, and cannabis moved from the pharmacy manuals into the underground, taking with it everything that the doctors and healers of the 19th century had learned about its uses and limitations. What we are rediscovering today, with studies on CBD for epilepsy, on cannabinoids for chronic pain, on cannabis for nausea in chemotherapy patients, is not new. It is a rediscovery. It is modern science arriving, with far more sophisticated instruments. The same conclusions a doctor in Kansas reached in 1875 looking at a patient and saying, "This works, I don't know exactly why, but it works." The Old West was brutal. It was cruel. It was a place where human life had a small market value and where nature made no concessions. But within that brutality, there was also a radical pragmatism that modern medicine sometimes loses. If it works, use it. Don't wait for the theory. Don't wait for the approval. Use what the land offers in the best way you can, and hope it is enough. 12 ways. One plant. And behind each one of them, a human being in pain, in fear, with the desperate hope of seeing one more sunrise. That is what the Old West really was. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. This kind of story, the one that isn't in the movies, the one that was buried under decades of politics and prejudice, is exactly what this channel exists to tell. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. The next story is coming, and it will change one more thing you thought you knew about the past.